this is last May, I was chatting with a source about something totally unrelated, and just casually at the end of our conversation, they threw in the fact that, oh, by the way, Price apparently is taking charter planes for all of his trips. And at that point, most of the trips that he had been taking, he hadn't been there for that long. He was confirmed to the job in February, and had just kind of started to get rolling at HHS. But a lot of the trips he was doing were centered around tackling the opioid epidemic. It's a big priority of the Trump administration. So he was doing these, multi-state tours. And once I talked to this person, I realized, once I just started looking, where he was going. So this is over a 2-day period, as you can see. He went to 4 states that are not that close to one another. And I thought, how would you do this in 2 days if you were flying commercial, or, I don't know how you get to, I think in Lansing, Michigan, can you take a train in, or probably not. So it seemed so, even at that point, it seemed sort of, it was half not believable, but also, you wonder, obviously all of us have flown commercial airlines, and how on earth could you do a 4-state tour in 2 days? Seems impossible, right? So that was when the first thing started, and, well, let me go back. So, I skipped over a long period of time, but basically, I guess to show that from May to September, there was a lot of legwork that had to go into taking that tip, even though we thought it was credible, just given where it was coming from. And we definitely hit roadblocks over the summer as far as, trying to figure out, well, where is Price going? What's he doing? How often is he traveling? And part of the reason why that was is because, unlike prior administrations, one of the obstacles that we encountered was that HHS was not sending out, public notices of where the secretary would be traveling in advance of their travel. That was not the case with the Obama administration. In the Bush administration, it also wasn't true, based on my understanding of people who I've spoken with from that time. But that actually began to change in September, which is very fortuitous for us because we've been cataloging what we could figure out based on sourcing and blog posts and photos that were posted after the fact, and sort of putting together this big database of where we thought Price was going. So in September, what happened was again, the HHS had started to give a heads up about where the secretary would be traveling, and we knew that he was going to be going to, he took, I think, a trip to New Hampshire, and then he went to Philadelphia, again, for opioid-related trips. So through a combination, I guess, of source work, actually having advance notice, and talking to enough people about how charter aircraft flights in the DC area work, we knew that he was going to be leaving from Dulles, which is very far from HHS's headquarters in DC. There are lots of ways to get to Philadelphia that are much easier and much closer for those of you who are not from Washington. I think it's maybe a 10-minute drive from HHS headquarters to Union Station, and Reagan National Airport is much closer also, but the charter jet terminal is much smaller. So we knew that, well, he's probably going from Dulles, but we haven't proved it yet. So it happened. So we managed, this is the, I guess, Dan and I have written about this since we did an airport stakeout. We had a couple botched attempts before that, but this was the one that came through, and we managed to actually see him when he was returning from Philadelphia. Well, and I wish I had a photo, but I didn't want to crash my car, so I don't have one. And Dan was situated elsewhere. So basically at that point, I want to try to get into some of the roadblocks that we had to deal with the administration at this point. So we negotiated a lot with HHS, multiple interview requests for not just the secretary, but his chief of staff, who was responsible for knowing or / approving a lot of these trips. We never got that. We tried many times. They wouldn't even get with us on the phone. Before we published our first story, the only thing they would send was a written statement, which we found aggravating, to say the least, but because we couldn't understand why. We gave them, I think at the time what we said was the 5 trips that we wrote about on this September 19th story, we said, here's what we know. And so they knew what we knew, and they still wouldn't hop on the phone with us, which we thought was ridiculous, to put it mildly. So part of the reason why we went with that initial story, and this is maybe just, if you're working on a big project, one of the pieces of advice I would offer right now, we had a database that we're at that point where we had more than 20 flights that we thought that Price had taken privately. The reason why we went with this initial story about 5 is because we knew that it was the most rock-solid reporting we had at that time, and we didn't want to wait to maybe do one huge story about, the 24 flights, which we did later, because we were able to verify more details after we published the first one. And I guess for us, we thought, well, this is what we know right now, and we think that this might lead to additional information, because once the story's out there, people might be more willing to talk, which is what ended up happening. So, in the meantime, HHS at that point had fortunately gotten on the phone with us, which is good. We still hadn't gotten an interview. They were giving us false information, false reasons for how the charter flights started with Price, which we were able to verify later that their explanations were false. So you kind of get the picture. They weren't exactly cooperating. So September 28th, finally Price, this is the day before he ended up resigning. He was taking some responsibility for the aircraft that he had been taking. We had reported up to this point that we were able to verify, again, like more than 24 trips that he had taken on charter flights through a combination of source work, lots of, I'll talk about this in a minute, but there are sources of public information that tremendously helped our reporting, and we wouldn't have been able to do it without it. And so, I guess this is sort of how he was managing the damage control. And then, surely enough, within a day, this is after the president had expressed a lot of displeasure about Price's behavior, and he ended up resigning on a Friday afternoon. And obviously, I think his message for, I'll repay the cost of my seat wasn't enough, because we knew that probably the trips between the military aircraft he had taken overseas and the domestic flights, he had spent at least $1 million. But I think $52,000 was the figure that he said he would repay, so obviously that's a very small percentage. So, I wanted to put this Rocky gif up here because I think to say that overcoming the things you once thought you couldn't is the kind of how I felt about, I think Dan and I maybe both felt about the administration, because, or HHS in particular, it was a very, very challenging process dealing with them. Over the course of that 10-day period when we were reporting the stories, they did get slightly better. They would confirm certain details on background that we had. For example, there was a story we wrote about how Price was traveling to Georgia and Tennessee, where he has some personal connections, and there were questions about whether he was mixing personal business with official work. And HHS actually remarkably did confirm, yes, he did go to Nashville, yes, he had lunch with his son when he went on that trip, and there were a couple other things that they were willing to share. But I would say, by and large, they weren't particularly constructive. So I think for us, one of the biggest things, apart from, of course, like sourcing work that we were able to do inside the agency and people who were close to it, was USAspending.gov is a contract database for the federal government that someone flagged for us once our initial story came out, how you could find all of the contract amounts. And that's how we were able to actually do the math on how much he was spending, because all the contracts had been approved through a particular HHS office. for him taking the planes. That was hugely helpful. Obviously, at the state government level also, I feel like this is relevant because, you know, there are contract databases and RFPs that get approved, and so you can find, that's a really good resource. We had to dig through property records. That's how we knew that Price had personal connections in Tennessee and Georgia, because he owned property, and we had found like other public evidence that, you know, he used to take lots of trips and had obviously, you know, lived there, and so that was really useful also in kind of advancing the story with just the breadth of, you know, the extent of his travels and just how like widespread it was. So we also used flight tracking websites and data that we had to purchase. There were some things that we had to purchase. We were able to buy, I think, some flight data looking at flight numbers, et cetera, from different airports around the country once we knew where Price was flying to and from. So the other thing, social media can be a blessing and a curse, obviously, but there's a lot of, we were able to, when we were pulling together our database, you know, we could find, you know, photos of Price going to different events all around the country. We could find blog posts, we could find even local press clips, right, where we could see, oh, okay, so he did end up going to Chattanooga, Tennessee on this day, and he was in Colorado on this day. And so that was really, really useful, actually. And we also used Facebook to try to, I think Dan tried to reach out to Price's son to even talk to us. I don't think he got very far, is what I know. But you know, that you know, it's a way to also find people. And we found people through Twitter and Facebook that were at some of the events that Price was at to say, oh, was he here? What did he do? What was he speaking about? You know, et cetera. And that was really, really useful in kind of providing like a lot of context for his trips, other than what we could prove on our own. So I would say this is probably the last part, is the last resort, but FOIA, obviously we did FOIA things, we still have not gotten them back, unsurprisingly. So waiting on HHS to do that, so including all of his travel schedules and calendars, but you know, sometimes actually I think state public records laws, if you're dealing with things at the state government level, they are way easier. I think if they're, you know, if federal FOIA operated as fast as state public record statutes do, I think it'd be a miracle. We would all be writing a million stories a day because you would get so much more information. So anyway, so that's my spiel. I've probably gone over, but so if you want to read more, first this is how to get a hold of me if you have any questions. Dan and I also co-wrote a magazine piece about a more concise version of how we were able to do the Price stories, and so you're welcome to read it at this website along with all of our other coverage.